Summers join us from the silverbulletspodcast.com. Please join him there for top-notch Ohio State football coverage. Shannon, before I let you go, I'm going to throw a college football playoff scenario at you and then get your take on what you think is going to happen in Indianapolis on Saturday night. All right, college football playoff scenario. It almost seems like people are pitting Ohio State versus Alabama, and it may well come down to that. If we get what we expect, the SEC winner is in, the ACC is in, Oklahoma's in if they win. So it comes down to one spot, and if Ohio State runs the table and with one step left, of course, Wisconsin's going to grab it as an undefeated team. I would hope that this would be all craziness, what people were talking about weeks ago with Wisconsin not getting in, even undefeated. But you knock off Northwestern, Iowa, Michigan, and then Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship, and you're undefeated. There should be no questions there. Anyway, if it comes down to the Buckeyes winning against Wisconsin versus Alabama's resume, what are your thoughts about how that would take place? And then if you can rip off your scarlet and gray, what you think is the fairest outcome?
First, I'll take off my scarlet and gray and just say the simple fact of a lot of fans and a lot of pundits or whatnot have been saying we need to expand to an 8 playoff team scenario. Here now you're sitting there not thinking of the kids. You're going to add an extra game in order, an extra game or two for these guys, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. You want your 8-game playoff scenario. You have it currently. The last week of the season, rivalry week. That's the first round. The second round is this weekend with the conference championship games, and then you have your semifinals. If you lose any games in week 14 or week 13, if you want to call it, in week 14, you don't deserve to be in the playoffs. I don't care if it's the Buckeyes. I don't care if it's the Crimson Tide. I don't care who it is. If you can't show up and win your final game, you need to be out. It's been that way for the BCS era. It's been that way before the BCS era. It's cost Ohio State, I don't know how many shots at national champions because they would lose to Michigan the final game of the season. And it should still, that's the tradition of college football. Stick with that tradition. That's your playoff situation. And I don't think Alabama should get in because they lost to Auburn. Not because they didn't play in a national, in a conference game, but because they lost that last week. You're supposed to be getting better as the season goes on. And that last game of the season, you're supposed to be hitting on all, cylinders in order to be impressing the playoff committee, not losing.
So you're a proponent of waiting the games. The games are more important as we go through the season.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you start off the season and you're learning your team. Your team's, learning everything. Look at 2014 with Ohio State. That Saturday when Ohio State lost to Virginia Tech, the whole Big Ten lost. Everybody buried the Big Ten that year. Ohio State, they kept getting better. Going to Michigan State, I think the second or third week before the end of the season, throttled Michigan State, looked really good. Went into Michigan, throttled them, looked really good. Went over to Wisconsin, the Big Ten championship game, blew out Wisconsin 59-0. So obviously they were getting better as the season was going. It's a long season, and I think the November games have to take a play into it. Now, Ohio State lost to Iowa. Like we said, that's not excusable, and there's no reason for it. And it was the beginning of November. It should disqualify them. In a sense, yes, you're exactly right. But now you look at, all right, if USC wins, if TCU knocks off Oklahoma, one of these teams with 2 losses should get in over Alabama because Alabama lost last week. Any team that loses in their conference championship game should not be having a conversation, well, we need to still go ahead and put them in a conference championship when you're hearing stuff like if Miami were to beat Clemson, Clemson should still deserve a shot. No, this is the second round of the playoffs now, in my opinion.
So this is a unique take. I like this, Shannon. So if I'm hearing this correctly, the SEC's in, the ACC's in. Let's say Wisconsin wins. They're in. You believe that what would happen otherwise? Let's say Oklahoma and USC. So you would simply be deciding between Oklahoma and USC to get into the playoff.
Mm-hmm.
If Ohio State wins, so you've got the ACC in, the SEC in, and then you're deciding between 3 2-loss teams to get in between Oklahoma, USC, and Ohio State, not Alabama.
Yeah, I would think you'd have to look at their strength of schedule. And
Okay.
this is where I think in the long run, if you want to get teams like Alabama to stop scheduling Citadel and, cupcake schools and stuff like that, this is where you start getting these teams. I mean, look at the Big 12 has all of a sudden made a switch to start scheduling more Power 5 teams earlier in the season. Like look at TSU and or TCU and Ohio State playing next year. So what happened in 2014 to the Big 10 saying that their schedules were cupcakes because they're not playing anybody during the preseason, if you will, their non-conference games. Now they're starting to get other big, the Power 5 teams scheduled in, and that's what we need to get going here.
So, to play devil's advocate, let me throw out this situation. And it almost happened basically with USC last year. They started 1-3. They ran the table. They won the conference. They did not win the conference championship. They beat Washington, who won the conference championship. They were kind of considered the best team, but they didn't get to the conference championship game. But let's say, pick your team. They lose their first 3 games of the season. They win 9 consecutive games. They make the playoff.
Like I said, a lot of it has to entail the strength of schedule. I mean, you look at last year, Ohio State lost to Penn State. Penn State goes on to win the Big Ten. They go on to win the Big Ten championship. People are saying, hey, Penn State should have got in over Ohio State. And I understand that argument, but their out of conference game of Pitt that they lost, and Ohio State went to Oklahoma and they beat Oklahoma. So that strength of schedule should play itself out. I think the strength of schedule is something that really needs to be taken more into consideration. Now, when you say that and you look at Wisconsin and say, hey, their strength of schedule is in the 60s and, they're undefeated, but they're undefeated. An undefeated team should be in there. That's a Power 5 team. No, I mean, there's no question about that, in my opinion.
So last year, you believe Ohio State earned that spot over Penn State despite the championship?
Over Penn State, yes.
So I'm following your logic completely, and I'm not completely agreeing with it, but I find it interesting about the championship weekends kind of culminating at the end of the year and crediting the teams playing through rivalry week and into their conference championship game. But that's something Ohio State wasn't able to do last year.
Yeah, and that is something that with saying as far as, expanding the playoffs, it kind of hurts Ohio State when, you say that. But at the same time, and I'm not saying a 2-loss team shouldn't be in. I've never said that even last year that a 2-loss team shouldn't be in. But just based on the strength of schedule between Team A and Team B, that should be the criteria. And that's how we start getting teams like the Alabamas and Auburns or whatever to start scheduling better out of conference, even though Auburn had a pretty good one this year with Clemson.
Well, Alabama played Florida State. So I don't think it gets much better than that on paper. They can't control the Florida State crumble. They were playing the number 3 team in the country.
Give them credit for that, yes. But at the same time, I mean, you're scheduling FCS schools before your rivalry game. I mean, what is that? I mean, you look at Ohio State before the
scrimmage, Shannon.
We had Illinois this year, but we've had Michigan State the past couple of years. So, I mean, and then I think it's next year, the year after, we have Penn State before Michigan. So, I mean, I don't want to sit there and see a FCS school cupcake practice before you go and play your rival game. And then you go and choke in your rival game. How does that help you?
All right. My final take on this is that I believe Ohio State had a better resume than Penn State last year for the reasons that you cited. They had one less loss. They went to Oklahoma and beat what turned out to be a top 5 team in the country. Penn State played a marginal Pitt team and lost to them out of conference. So they had the better resume. I like to stick to the conference championships, and I believe that because we only have 5 conferences and we're trying to squeeze that into 4 spots, I said this all week after the selection was made last year that I would have selected Penn State over Ohio State. That being said, as it applies to this year, with all these people talking about Ohio State's awful loss at Iowa, and it was an awful loss and it looks ugly, that Alabama is not playing in its conference championship, that they should not be given that spot over Ohio State or anybody else, USC or Oklahoma, because they didn't win their conference. So that's how I would play it. And the one thing, to be fair here and follow my line of thinking, Shannon, for Ohio State fans, I'll give you a little argument here against Alabama. Everyone's focusing on the losses, and Alabama's loss at Auburn is certainly much better looking than Ohio State losing 2 games, one to Oklahoma, okay, but the Iowa game giving up 55 points on the road. But if you're going to apply that measurement to losses, you need to apply it to wins as well. And Alabama has not beaten a Penn State, number one. Number two, they have not beaten the likes of a Michigan State. So you could say that LSU and Mississippi State are Alabama's Michigan State win, but they barely squeezed by Mississippi State in the final minute, and they beat LSU unimpressively, but they beat them by a couple scores, but it was a fairly close game. If you're going to apply the ugly factor to the losses, then you need to apply the pretty factor to the wins, and Ohio State throttled a top 15 Michigan State team 48-3.
I agree. And this is why college football is so great, is being able to have different opinions, different talks. And I mean, I sit there and say, well, if you want expansion week, the last week and a conference championship, but oh, hey, Ohio State didn't play a conference championship last year, but you still feel that they should be getting in. I understand how that kind of looks, but I just, at the end of the day, if you lose the last week of the season, if you lose a conference championship, that should be null and void, no playoffs for you at all, period. And if you lose in the beginning of the season and your team's getting better, that's what the criteria is. And then you add in your strength of schedule.